Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook. Today we're talking about Chapter 13, People and Progress from 1910 through 1959 in Latin America. So let us begin. So by way of introduction, from 1910 to about 1960, Latin America underwent a vast process of change from rural to urban, middle, and working class modern life. There was change in all aspects of life: employment, housing, food, entertainment, and art. There was also a prolonged process of transition or transformation of gender roles. The common people, as always in Latin America, struggled to maintain control over their everyday lives. There was a massive migration from the country to the city, but the elite upper class view towards the social question can be typified by a Brazilian saying that the social question was a matter for the police. In the countryside, people resisted change to their long-held values and practices. Also, some members of the upper classes resisted modernity. The elite looked upon popular culture as vulgar, products of the slums. The wealthy were torn between their desire for change in their countries and worries about their ability to control the change. The transformation from rural to urban did not change the attitude of the wealthy towards the lower classes, who they feared. The wealthy tried mightily to control the lower classes culturally. They tried to turn the immigrants and migrants into quiet workers loyal to the nation and to control gender relations. Elites relied upon the state to control the working class and migrant subcultures. Families, relationships in the home, leisure time, and the tastes of workers were all things that the elites attempted to influence. Patriarchy and male hegemony ruled over society, with massive intrusions into local and personal areas. The movement from the country to the city was a crucial process in Latin America. In 1950, 61% of the population was still rural. But from 1950 to 1960, 25% of all Argentines abandoned the country for the city. And the same is roughly true for Chileans and Brazilians, 29% of Chileans and 19% of Brazilians. They left their homes because neither jobs nor land was available for them. Land reform was only gave marginal land, but without available credit to develop it. Because of technological improvements, large landowners did not require as many workers. Export commodities required only seasonal workers. Cities offered more employment and better opportunities for education, which offered in turn upward mobility and improved health care, not only for the migrants but for their children. Urban slums offered miserable conditions but were infinitely better than rural poverty. Even in the cities, everyday life was a constant struggle. The literacy rate for those over 15, in other words, adults, was only about 50%. Only 7% of the people had a secondary education. Large companies now employed industrial workers. Impersonal bureaucracies replaced personal relations. City streets were unsanitary, and the vast influx of migrants increased pressures on the existing infrastructures beyond the breaking point. The relentless drive to modernize took an exacting toll on forests and the environment. Rural areas steadily deteriorated for lower classes since independence. Most workers faced lifelong indebtedness. It was nearly impossible to feed a family on the produce of small individually owned plots. Rural life was so difficult that vast numbers left and fled to the cities. Life was precarious in the thousands of small villages in Brazil, Peru, and Mexico, and elsewhere in Latin America. The villages were isolated and there was no electricity. Many inhabitants spoke only Quechua or Aymara in the Andes, or Nahuatl in Mexico. There were improvements in rural technology. The Molino de Nixtamal, for example, ground soaked maize kernels into damp flours, saving countless hours of work for Mexican women in the country. The foot-operated sewing machine was another improvement. Nevertheless, rural conditions were so bad that many migrated from the country to the city. There was a long process of socialization and accommodation to urban life. This led to a proletarianization of the working class. Conflicts between workers and companies increased. Examples given in the book include textile manufacturing in Medellin, Colombia, and copper mining at the El Teniente mine in Chile. Problems where social control emerged, and labor strikes multiplied in the 1930s. As companies grew larger and required larger bureaucracies of middle and upper management, there was a loss of personal relations between the employers and employees. The companies also developed a preference for male employees over females. Employees were struggling to assert control over their workers during this period. Some of the strategies of social control that employers developed included improved working conditions, relatively high salaries. Sometimes they used repressive tactics. The second part was paternalistic practices to make workers' lives more comfortable. Some large employers supplied schools, bonuses, social and cultural events, and opportunities. These efforts to reform workers reasserted aggressive patriarchal values which masculinized the work values. Female workers were often viewed as a threat to proper gender relations. Virginity, for example, was crucial to patriarchy. It was assumed that single women were virgins, and the companies stopped hiring married women and single mothers. Employers sought to civilize women by offering classes on homemaking, money management, and other domestic skills. Single women who became pregnant were fired immediately. The miners at El Teniente were paid better than any other occupation in Chile, 50% higher wages, because there was a labor shortage. There were also unethical recruiters, enganchadores, who used alcohol to get prospective employees drunk and to get them to sign up. There was brutal work in terrible conditions with toxic fumes, lack of protective equipment. Many miners developed silicosis, a respiratory disease, and the living conditions were also terrible, no electricity, light, or ventilation, with a high cost of living. The cutting edge of modernization was most evident in the cities. They were overcrowded and unsanitary. They had epidemic diseases, and they were teeming with uneducated migrants. The divide between the wealthy and the lower class widened and grew more obvious, and the middle class developed new attitudes toward women. As far as cities, there was massive urban renewal in Rio de Janeiro from 1902 to 1910. In Mexico City, we see what one might call a process of super-urbanization. Country people thronged into the city in increasing numbers after 1940. 1/4 of new factories were located in Mexico City by 1970. From 1940 to 1970, the Mexico City population grew from 1.5 to 8.5 millions of inhabitants. The middle classes expanded as the government grew and foreign businesses multiplied. What mattered most was to maintain respectability. The middle class employees were economically precarious. Their paychecks barely was enough to cover expenses. It was impossible for middle class people to buy a home, and health care was not much better than it was for workers. Women gradually moved up into the white-collar employment. In 1908 in Peru, women made up only 1% of the white-collar workforce, but by the 1920s, women were moving into retail, banking, insurance, and commerce. By 1931, 5% of all working women were white-collar workers. The typical image of a white-collar man demanded that he be the breadwinner and that his wife stay at home. In Mexico, we see the era of the modern woman, which in Mexico was known as La Chica Moderna. Employment and financial freedom instilled a new attitude in women during this period of time. Although only a small minority, they were the topic of a lot of public discussion. This was similar to what one sees in the United States in the 1920s as the flappers, self-confident women who are perceived as racy, flirtatious, and assertive. The independent, sensuous female. This shook male culture. Self-reliance, self-determination, and self-worth were virtues, but were masculine virtues, primarily for males, not for women. In terms of popular culture, we have a lot of new developments in dance and music. One that emerged out of Buenos Aires, the slums of Buenos Aires, was the tango. This was a symbol of rural Argentine traditions. The tango combined the rural milonga with the Spanish contradanza and the African elements. This emerged as a result of a synthetic mix of the vast movement of people to the cities, affecting popular cultures, folk songs, dance, and crafts. In the movie Moulin Rouge, there's a scene with the song Roxanne that plays upon the Buenos Aires culture and tango. In Brazilian popular culture, you have the samba. Samba was also looked down upon by the Brazilian upper classes. Samba became a symbol of Brazil's mixture of African and European culture. It began in the poorest neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro in the 19th century. By the 1920s, clubs were taking over the carnival, and women began to participate openly. Dr. Attal was a well-known artist in Mexico named Geraldo Murillo. He was an important sponsor of the Muralist movement of the 1920s, and he was a good painter in his own right. He promoted popular art in 1921. In painting and literature, you have several trends known as Modernismo and Indigenismo, or Nativism. These were two trends in Latin America during this time. Also, the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío was the founder of Modernismo, and the Mexican painter Saturnino Herrán depicted Indians and mestizos living and working. You see a couple of Herrán's pictures there of an Indian woman and a group of mestizos on a boat. The Mexican muralists included Diego Rivera and David Alfaro Siqueiros, José Clemente Orozco. José Vasconcelos was the Minister of Education during the administration of Álvaro Obregón from 1920 to 1924. Vasconcelos sought to educate the illiterate Mexican population and make them into Mexicans. Modernization and national identity went hand in hand with culture and the arts. This is a picture called the working class, or the Los Obreros. And here's a picture by Rivera called Exploitación. Siqueiros wrote a manifesto in 1923 setting out the goal of the muralists. As creators of beauty, they must ensure that their work presents ideological propaganda. The muralists rewrote Mexican history on a grand scale with enormous paintings on walls for the workers and the country people. In their view, art was inherently political. Diego Rivera painted a stairwell in the National Palace of the Zocalo, picturing the entire history of Mexico. Pictorial history for the working classes. Culture in Brazil had to confront not only indigenous heritage, but the African heritage. Tarsila do Amoral. This is an example of some of her paintings. Also, we have Candido Portinari, and this is one of his pictures, Brazilian artists. There was also Mario de Andrade and Gilberto Freire, and I'm afraid we're out of time we arrive to the conclusion. Thank you for watching. Please read the chapter.